The email arrived quietly. No warning, no heads up, no polite buffer from a publicist or assistant who usually steps in to protect high-profile people from unexpected communication. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just a direct message, straight from Prince Harry, landing in Ben Affleck's inbox like a stone dropped into still water. But here's the real question. Why would a Hollywood A-lister known for guarding his privacy suddenly receive a personal email from a royal who swore he wanted out of the spotlight? And more importantly, why did Ben Affleck take one look at it and delete it without responding? People assume that powerful men always battle each other publicly. They expect raised voices, confrontations, dramatic statements released through attorneys or PR teams. But sometimes the biggest rejection isn't loud. It's silent. It's a closed door, sealed without explanation. And that's exactly what happened here. At least, that's what insiders say. But let's slow down for a moment, because before we jump into the shock of the deleted message, we have to understand one thing. This wasn't random. Harry didn't email Ben Affleck out of boredom. He didn't accidentally type the wrong address. He didn't send a casual message like a friend checking in. No, this was intentional. But the strangest part? It wasn't really about the F1 Grand Prix in Las Vegas at all. Or was it? Let's rewind. Picture Las Vegas in peak Grand Prix weekend. The strip shut down. Neon lights bouncing off the bodywork of million-dollar cars. Celebrities flying in from every direction. Stadiums, private jets, rooftop suites overlooking the track. It's not just an event. It's a hierarchy. People don't get in because they want to. They get in because someone powerful wants them there. And Ben Affleck is one of those people. Not just because he's an Oscar-winning actor, director, and household name, but because he knows everyone who matters, quietly. He's plugged into rooms where cameras aren't allowed. Deals are whispered, not written. Friendships are currency. So when Prince Harry reached out, it wasn't just about attending a race. It was about access. Access to a world that has nothing to do with Buckingham Palace. And here comes the first uncomfortable truth. Prince Harry is no longer someone who gets invited everywhere automatically. Not in Hollywood. Not in elite social circles. Not after everything that has happened over the past few years. And that matters. Because requesting entry into a world that doesn't automatically open the door anymore creates tension. Especially when the person knocking believes the door should still open. But before we go deeper, let's ask the question nobody wants to say out loud. Why Ben Affleck? Why not someone Harry already knows well? Why not another royal-adjacent celebrity? Why not someone who publicly supported him? Why choose a man who is famously selective about who he allows into his personal space? There are theories. Some say Harry thought Ben would relate to him. Two men who have lived under scrutiny, battled addiction narratives, tried to rebuild reputations. Two men who have been photographed in moments they never wanted the world to see. Others believe Harry wasn't seeking emotional support at all. He was seeking visibility. Because showing up next to Ben Affleck at a global event does something powerful. It sends a message that says, I still belong in the highest rooms. I still have the right connections. I'm still part of the world's inner circle. But here's where things get even more interesting. Ben Affleck didn't see it that way. Not anymore. Not after everything that's unfolded around Harry recently. Because in Hollywood, association isn't casual. It's strategic. Stand next to the wrong person, even for a photo, and suddenly your name is attached to them in headlines you never approved. And Ben Affleck knows that better than almost anyone. So when the email came in, direct, personal, unexpected, it didn't feel flattering. It felt suspicious. But what made it even more strange is the timing. Why now? Why during one of the biggest, most exclusive events of the year? Why after months of silence? To understand that, we need to go back, not just a few days, but years. Because contrary to what most people believe, this wasn't the first time Harry tried to connect with Hollywood power players on a personal level. It's just the first time the attempt allegedly got shut down immediately. But we'll come back to that. For now, imagine Ben Affleck reading the email. He's at home, not on a set, not in a studio, not surrounded by assistants and managers, just a normal moment in his day. He opens the message. He scans it. And almost instantly, before thinking through the political or social weight, his reaction is instinctive. No. Delete. No response. No forwarding it to a manager. No discussion. Just silence. and silence sends a louder message than any reply ever could. But here's where the story turns. Ben Affleck wasn't the only one who saw the email. Someone else did, before he made his decision. Someone much closer. Someone whose opinion holds more weight than any advisor, publicist, or studio executive. And their reaction wasn't neutral. It wasn't casual. It was immediate. But before we get to that moment, there's something we need to ask. Why didn't Harry go through the usual channels? Celebrities with massive public profiles don't contact other celebrities directly unless there's a specific reason. So did Harry want privacy? Or did he want urgency? Or was he testing something? Like whether a direct approach would work better than a formal one. Because let's not forget, Harry was once the person everyone wanted access to, not the person asking for access. That role reversal changes everything, and it creates a question that hangs in the air like smoke. Is Harry still unaware of how much the world around him has changed? Or does he know, and is desperately trying to stop the slide? Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, this isn't about taking sides. It's about understanding dynamics. Hollywood isn't emotional, it's strategic. People protect their image the same way royal families protect their legacy. They don't stand next to someone whose reputation is unpredictable. They don't attach themselves to ongoing controversy. They don't risk becoming part of someone else's storyline. Which brings us back to Las Vegas. The F1 Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It was a stage, a spotlight, a global broadcast watched by millions. And Harry showing up beside Ben Affleck would have triggered the headlines instantly. Hollywood royalty meets British royalty. Ben Affleck welcomes Prince Harry into elite inner circle. Is Harry rebuilding his power connections? Now ask yourself, would Ben Affleck want those headlines? Would Jennifer Lopez? Would their carefully curated public image benefit from that moment? Or would it open doors they've spent years closing? Because here's the part most people forget. Ben and Jennifer just rebuilt their lives, their reputations, their boundaries, their peace. So when an unexpected email arrives from someone living inside a global media storm, the decision isn't personal. It's protective. And that might be the real reason the message was deleted, not rejected. Protected against. But before we go further, let's step into another angle. What exactly did Harry say? Not word for word, but conceptually. Sources claim the tone wasn't casual. It wasn't a friendly, "Hope you're well, would be great to catch up." It was a request loaded with assumption. A request that implied closeness that wasn't there anymore, or maybe never was. And that's when everything shifted. Because there's nothing more uncomfortable than someone acting like a door is open when, in reality, it was closed years ago. But here's where things get even more complicated. Ben Affleck and Harry weren't strangers. Their paths crossed more than once. Their lives had overlapping circles. They shared mutual acquaintances. They shared physical spaces at events the public never saw. So what changed? Why did one interaction, quiet, unseen, and all communication? And why did Harry ignore that history and try again now? The answer is coming, but not yet. Because the introduction isn't about revealing the truth. It's about one thing: setting the stage for the moment where everything flips. So for now, here's the only thing you need to hold on to. The email wasn't the shocking part. The silence was. Because silence means more than rejection. It means someone has already made up their mind. And according to one insider, that's exactly what happened here. Which brings us to the final moment of the introduction. The part where everything that seems random suddenly looks intentional. Because what if Ben didn't delete the email out of annoyance, but out of fear? Fear of what it would lead to. Fear of what it would imply. Fear of what might happen if he said yes. Because the truth is, Hollywood isn't afraid of scandal. It's afraid of becoming attached to one it didn't choose. And that's why, as the insider said, this wasn't just a request. It was something else entirely. Something Ben Affleck recognized instantly. Something he wanted no part of. Which leads us to the question that takes us into Chapter 1. What exactly was in that email that made Ben believe it wasn't an invitation, but a setup? The message didn't arrive at midnight. It didn't pop up during a chaotic moment or in the middle of a crisis. It came on an ordinary day, at a completely ordinary hour. And somehow, that made it even stranger. Because when something unexpected arrives during an already dramatic moment, the brain is prepared. But when it shows up during calm, silence makes the impact louder. The email wasn't routed through a manager. It didn't pass through a talent agency, a scheduling assistant, a publicist, or a legal filter. There was no subject line marked urgent, just a simple sender name. And that was the first shock. Prince Harry. Ask yourself this. If you were Ben Affleck, one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, what would you do if a royal emailed you personally? Would you think it was a prank? A hacked account? A mistake? Or would some small part of you realize immediately that this wasn't accidental? Because Ben Affleck knew one thing with absolute certainty. Royalty does not reach out directly unless there is a very specific reason. So why now? Let's rewind the moment, slowly. Ben was at home. A quiet day. No camera crews. No obligations pulling him in 10 different directions. Just normal life. Coffee on the counter. Phone nearby. Laptop open, not for dramatic Hollywood contract negotiations, but something simple. Emails, the kind everyone checks without thinking. Then the name appeared. Not buried in a long list. Not hidden beneath newsletters and industry updates. It stood alone, like it wanted to be noticed. But here's the part almost no one understands. Ben Affleck doesn't react quickly. He is not impulsive. Not anymore. Not after years of learning what one unplanned moment can cost. So he didn't panic. He didn't call anyone. He didn't even open the message right away. He just stared at the name. Prince Harry. And something didn't feel right. Now imagine being in that position. Someone who once lived inside a world where the doors opened for him automatically is suddenly sending a personal request. Not through security. Not through formal channels. Not through the silent machinery of influence. Direct. But why did that matter so much? Because direct communication bypasses protection. It's intimate. Intentional. It means the sender wants something without witnesses. But what exactly? Let's talk about the unspoken rules of celebrity communication. Most people think famous individuals casually text and email each other the way regular people do. That's not how it works. In reality, messages are filtered. Requests are screened. Boundaries are enforced by teams long before the celebrity even knows someone tried contacting them. Not because they're rude, because they have to be protected. Every message represents risk. A headline, a screenshot, a misunderstanding, an expectation. So when someone bypasses all of that, it sends a silent message. I don't want the official answer. I want your answer. Which brings us back to Harry. At this moment in time, he was no longer just a public figure. He was a public storm. Every appearance triggered speculation. Every friendship raised questions. Every move became a narrative he could not control. And maybe that's why he reached out directly. Because the official channels no longer work the way they used to. But Ben didn't know the motive yet. All he knew was that this email was unexpected, and that alone made it suspicious. Now, let's talk about the turning point. When Ben finally opened the message, it wasn't dramatic. There was no alarming subject line. No emotional plea. It was polite. Almost too polite. And that's where tension entered the room. Because sometimes politeness is more unsettling than bluntness. Especially when it comes from someone who shouldn't be emailing you directly in the first place. Sources say the wording suggested familiarity. Not casual friendship. Not surface-level acquaintance. Something in between. Like two people who once shared a moment the public never knew about. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Ben Affleck didn't feel the same. Not anymore. The distance that had grown between them wasn't accidental. And it wasn't recent. It was old. Quiet. Intentional. But Harry didn't seem to realize that. Or maybe he did, and thought this email could reopen the door anyway. Now let's pause and ask the audience. Have you ever had someone reach out to you after a long time, as if nothing happened? Someone who ignored the history. Someone who assumed they could just walk back into your life? How did it feel? Awkward? Confusing? Unsettling? That's the emotional territory we've entered. Ben Affleck wasn't confused because he didn't know Harry. He was uncomfortable because he did. Which brings us to a question that will follow us throughout this story. Was this email an attempt at reconnection? Or an attempt at reinvention? Now, let's shift to the environment around the moment. Ben was not alone when the message arrived. He wasn't in a hotel. He wasn't traveling. He wasn't locked away in a studio. He was home, where real reactions happen. There's something different about reading an unexpected message when you're surrounded by normal life. There's no performance, no public pressure, no mask, just instinct. He read the request. Prince Harry wanted to join Ben at the Las Vegas F1 Grand Prix. Not attend separately, not meet casually, Join him. That wording matters. Because asking someone to meet you at an event is neutral. Asking someone to take you into their space is personal. But here's the twist. Ben Affleck wasn't even sure he wanted to attend publicly himself. The F1 Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It was a high-visibility event, swarming with cameras, celebrities, sponsorships, and the constant hum of media attention. For someone trying to protect peace, it was a risky environment. So why would he bring someone whose presence multiplied attention? Let's put it this way. Ben Affleck could walk into the event and be photographed as Ben Affleck. Ben Affleck standing next to Prince Harry would not be photographed as Ben Affleck. It would become a headline, a speculation storm, a question machine. Who invited whom? Are they working together? Is there a project? A documentary? A statement? A reconciliation? A betrayal? Hollywood knows this pattern well. Once a narrative begins, no one controls it. Not the celebrity, not their publicist, not the truth. So Ben hesitated, not because he wanted to be unkind, but because he wanted to avoid stepping into a story he didn't choose. Now, let's add another layer. Most people imagine that celebrities make decisions based only on their own preferences. That's not true. There are inner circles, personal boundaries, people whose voices matter more than any studio or advisor. And in Ben's life, that person was present when the email came through. This is where the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No tension. Just a simple question. Why now? It's the kind of question that seems harmless until you realize it carries a deeper meaning. Why would someone who hasn't been in your life for years suddenly want to stand beside you at one of the most visible events in the world? What changed? Who changed? What do they need? Because requests are never just requests, especially at that level. Now imagine the silence in the room after reading the message. Not angry, not shocked, just thoughtful. Ben didn't respond right away. He didn't delete it immediately. He waited. And waiting can be more revealing than reacting. Because waiting means you're considering consequences. Not emotionally, strategically. Let's ask the audience directly. If you were in his position, would you reply? Would you risk being pulled into someone else's media orbit? Would you trust that the request was harmless? Would you ignore the timing? Or would you hesitate too? Because hesitation is the human response to uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what this email created. But here comes the first real turning point of this chapter. Before Ben could decide what to do, someone else responded emotionally to the situation. Not to Harry, to the idea. And that emotional response changed everything. Because suddenly, the question wasn't, should Ben go to the F1 event with Harry? It became, what would saying yes cost? Not financially, not socially, personally. And that's when the hesitation turned into clarity. But clarity doesn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes clarity feels like loss. Because deleting the message wasn't about power, it was about protection. Protection of privacy. Protection of peace. Protection of a life rebuilt carefully, piece by piece. And here's the final moment of this chapter. The shift that will take us straight into chapter 2. Ben Affleck didn't decide based on the request. He decided based on the wording. Something in the message didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like an entry point. And entry points lead somewhere. So before he closed his laptop, before he returned to his day, before he allowed the moment to fade into normal life, Ben Affleck made a choice. A quiet one. A final one. But what he didn't know was this. Someone else had already made a decision of their own. And that decision would change everything. Because it meant the email didn't stay private. And the warning that followed didn't come from Hollywood. It came from someone much closer. The request wasn't small. Prince Harry didn't ask to simply attend the Las Vegas Grand Prix. He asked to join Ben Affleck's inner circle. And that changed everything. Because there is a difference, a massive difference, between showing up somewhere and being brought somewhere. One is attendance. The other is endorsement. And in Hollywood, endorsement can be more dangerous than any scandal. But let's slow down, because the shift didn't happen instantly. It happened in layers. The first layer was surprise. The second was confusion. The third was realization. And that was the moment where the stakes began to rise. Because Ben Affleck wasn't just being asked to share a space. He was being asked to share his name, his access, his reputation. But here's the twist. Harry didn't seem to understand that. Or maybe he understood all too well. Let's rewind to the exact wording. Sources say the message wasn't phrased like a casual invitation. Not a simple "are you going?" or "would be great to catch up if you're around." It was something more structured, something that suggested a plan. Harry wanted to be with Ben, not near him, with him, as in, same table, same suite, same cameras, same narrative. That's not a coincidence. That's strategy, and Ben recognized it immediately. Now, to understand why this was a problem, you have to understand what the Las Vegas F1 Grand Prix really is. Most people imagine a race. Cars speeding at 200 miles per hour, engines roaring, crowds cheering. But that's not the real event. The real event happens off the track, in the private lounges, in the restricted paddock areas, in the VIP hospitality suites sponsored by brands whose names never appear on billboards but control half of the luxury world. The Las Vegas Grand Prix is a social hierarchy disguised as a sporting event. You don't just walk in. You are escorted in. You are placed, not seated. You are photographed, not casually captured. And every person inside those rooms means something. Their presence sends a signal. Their absence sends a message. So imagine the situation. Ben Affleck attends the Grand Prix alone. He is Ben Affleck, private citizen, actor, director, respected Hollywood figure. Ben Affleck attends the Grand Prix with Prince Harry. Suddenly, he becomes part of a narrative. Not his narrative, Harry's. And that is exactly what Ben wanted to avoid. But here's where things get even more complicated. In Hollywood, power doesn't operate the way people think. It's not about fame. It's about access. Real access. Access to people who can make things happen without signing anything. And Ben Affleck has earned that access slowly, quietly, privately. He's not someone who flaunts his connections. He doesn't use them to gather attention. He protects them. So when someone, especially someone as unpredictable in the press as Harry, asks to enter that protected world, alarms go off. Let's ask the audience directly. If you have something rare, something fragile, do you hand it over easily? Or do you guard it? Do you risk letting someone in who might not understand the value of what they're being given? Or do you hesitate? Because hesitation isn't rejection. Hesitation is wisdom. Now, back to the moment in Ben's house. He read the email. He processed it. But he didn't react emotionally. Ben doesn't operate on impulse anymore. He operates on experience. He knows that one photo can create a year's worth of fallout. He knows that standing next to the wrong person can erase months of rebuilding peace. So instead of responding, he thought. He waited. But someone else didn't. Someone else reacted instantly. Not because of Harry. Because of what Harry represented. Before we get there, let's explore why Harry might have chosen Ben in the first place. There are several theories circulating behind the scenes. Theory 1. Harry wanted legitimacy. Standing next to Ben Affleck says something powerful. It doesn't scream desperation. It signals status. Ben is the type of celebrity who doesn't need attention. People who don't need attention automatically hold more power. Theory 2. Harry wanted safety. Ben isn't messy. He isn't loud. He isn't unpredictable. He's private, controlled, respected by both Hollywood and the everyday public. Harry standing next to someone like that could soften his image instantly. Theory 3. Harry wanted belonging. Not celebrity belonging. Male belonging. There is a difference. Hollywood is filled with men who perform confidence but are drowning in insecurity. Ben isn't one of them. Harry might have wanted to stand near someone who rebuilt himself after the world tried to tear him apart. Someone who reclaimed his life. Someone who survived humiliation and came back stronger. But here's the irony. If that was Harry's intention, it had the opposite effect. Because what he saw as connection, Ben saw as intrusion. And that's where the disconnect began. Now let's talk about exclusivity. The Las Vegas Grand Prix wasn't just a big event. It was the biggest F1 event ever held in the US. Tickets weren't sold, they were granted. Celebrities didn't ask to attend, they were invited. Brands didn't compete for placement, they negotiated for presence. Every seat inside the high-tier lounges cost more than most homes. Every visible attendee was part of a curated list. So imagine the pressure. If Ben Affleck brings Prince Harry, people will assume Ben vouched for him. And when you vouch for someone in elite circles, you are tied to them. Their reputation becomes yours, temporarily or permanently. And right now, Prince Harry's reputation in Hollywood is complicated. Not ruined. Not destroyed. Complicated. Some people admire him. Some people avoid him. Most people don't know where they stand. And in Hollywood, uncertainty is more dangerous than scandal. Because scandal can be managed. Unpredictability cannot. So when Harry asked to join Ben, not just attend, he crossed an invisible boundary. A boundary Harry may not have known existed, or one he ignored. Now let's explore the middle of the moment, the shift that turned confusion into concern. When Ben read the email, he didn't think about the race. He thought about the ripple effect. What would the headlines be? What assumptions would be made? What stories would be invented by people who weren't even there? Because when two high-profile men stand together publicly, the world writes the script for them. And sometimes that script is impossible to undo. Then came the part nobody expected. A voice, calm, steady, familiar, responded before Ben even asked for an opinion. Not dramatically, just honestly. The question was simple. Why now? But the meaning was not. Why now after silence? Why now, after everything that unfolded publicly? Why now, when Ben was finally living a peaceful life again? Timing isn't just coincidence. Timing is intention. So the real question became, was Harry reaching out because he wanted connection, or because he needed placement? Because those are not the same thing. Let's pause and ask the audience. Have you ever been contacted by someone only when they needed something? Someone who disappeared during your worst moments and reappeared during theirs? How did it feel? Like reconnection? Or like convenience? Because that feeling matters. And that's the feeling that entered the room. Now let's move into the next turning point. For a brief moment, Ben considered responding. Not with enthusiasm, with politeness. A neutral decline. A respectful refusal. A gentle boundary. But before he could decide, something else happened. Someone close to him, very close, warned him not to reply at all. Not later. Not politely. Not even with distance. Not to respond at all. This wasn't Hollywood advice. This wasn't a publicist thinking strategically. This was personal. It came from someone whose perspective Ben trusts more than any industry voice. Someone who protects him. Someone who has watched what happens when he gets pulled back into chaos, by accident or by association. And their reasoning was simple, almost frightening in its clarity. If you respond, you open the door. If you don't respond, the door stays closed. And once a door is reopened, even slightly, it can never fully be shut again. Ben understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. Silence wasn't rejection. Silence was prevention. But what made the situation even heavier was this. They didn't think Harry reached out by chance. They believed he reached out because something was happening in his world. Something shifting. Something that made him reach for someone stable, grounded, respected. Something that made him want to stand beside Ben. But what was it? What changed in Harry's life at that exact moment? Why did he need visibility at the Las Vegas Grand Prix? Why did he need Ben Affleck, specifically? There is one answer circulating among insiders. Not confirmed. Not public. But whispered quietly. It wasn't about the event. It was about optics. Harry didn't want to attend the Grand Prix. He wanted to be seen attending the Grand Prix, next to someone who could stabilize his image instantly. And whether that's true or not, Ben couldn't risk it. Not now. Not ever. Which brings us to the final moment of the chapter. The moment where decision turned into action. Ben Affleck closed his laptop. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just quietly. He didn't respond. He didn't forward the message. He didn't ask his team to handle it. He chose silence. But silence is never the end of a story. Because silence creates questions. And questions create consequences. And in this case, the consequences were already moving, long before Ben realized it. Because someone else saw the email. Someone who shouldn't have. And they weren't just curious. They were alarmed. Which leads directly into the next chapter, the moment where the warning arrives. Not from Hollywood. Not from the media. From someone much closer. Someone whose reaction would change everything. The warning didn't come from Hollywood. It didn't come from a studio executive, a PR strategist, or a manager who monitors headlines like a stock market ticker. It came from someone much closer. And that's what made it impossible to ignore. Because when the outside world reacts, you can debate it. You can dismiss it. You can delay responding. But when the reaction comes from inside your own home, the impact is immediate. So let's step into that moment. The one that shifted everything from curiosity to concern. Ben Affleck had just read the email. He hadn't replied. He hadn't deleted it. He was still processing it, still trying to decide what the message meant, when someone else saw the sender's name. Not the content, just the name. Prince Harry. And the silence in the room changed. It wasn't tense. It wasn't dramatic. It was alert. There's a difference. Alert means something instinctive has been triggered. A protective instinct. A memory. A boundary. The voice that finally broke the silence wasn't shocked. It was steady, calm, but unmistakably serious. Why is he emailing you directly? Not what does he want? Not are you going? Not should you reply? Just one question. Why directly? That single word changed the conversation. Because direct communication means urgency, or secrecy, or strategy, and none of those options were good. Now let's pause and ask the audience. If someone who hasn't been part of your life for years suddenly reaches out, not through mutual friends, not through normal channels, but directly, what is your first thought? Are they reaching out because they miss you? Or because they need something? Because the difference between want and need can change everything. And that was the unspoken tension in the room. Before we go deeper, we need to understand something important. This warning did not come from insecurity. It came from experience. People around Ben have seen what happens when he gets pulled into situations he didn't choose. They've seen how fast peace can disappear, how quickly privacy can be invaded, how headlines can rewrite the truth before anyone speaks. So when the email appeared, the reaction wasn't emotional. It was protective. Now, who was the person who reacted? We don't need to name them. Their role is what matters. They were someone who has lived through the consequences of public chaos. Someone who understands that not all attention is good attention. Someone who has helped Ben rebuild a life defined by stability rather than spectacle. And they knew something instantly. If Ben replied, even politely, the door would open. And once a door opens, even slightly, it cannot be completely closed again. But that wasn't the only concern. There was something deeper, something about timing. Why now? That question carried weight. Because timing is never random at that level. People don't reach out when everything is going well for them. They reach out when something has shifted. So the real question became, what was happening in Harry's world that made him reach for someone he hadn't spoken to in years? Let's explore the possibilities, not as accusations, but as context. Because whether people like Harry or criticize him isn't the point. The point is understanding behavior. Harry had been under intense public pressure. Headlines were no longer predictable. Support was no longer guaranteed. Hollywood wasn't reacting to him with the same enthusiasm it once did. And in those moments, when doors begin to close, people instinctively search for new ones. Now, let's return to the reaction inside Ben's home. The person who saw the email didn't panic. They analyzed. Their reasoning unfolded in 3 simple points. First, responding would be perceived as agreement, even if the response was neutral. Second, silence would be safer than declining, because a refusal can be twisted into rejection. Silence cannot. Third, if Harry was reaching out strategically, replying would pull Ben into something he couldn't control. And that was the key word. Control. Ben had spent years rebuilding his life by regaining control of his image, his habits, his peace. Let's ask the audience another question. Have you ever worked hard to fix something in your life, only for one unexpected moment to threaten that progress? It doesn't take disaster to undo stability. Sometimes all it takes is the wrong association. Now we reach the turning point of the chapter, the moment the warning became crystal clear. The person said something simple, almost quiet. If you respond, he won't stop. That sentence hit harder than any dramatic argument. Because it wasn't about Harry personally. It was about pattern. When someone reaches out during a vulnerable moment in their life, they don't need one reply. They need ongoing access. And Ben couldn't give that. Not because he was cold. Not because he was judgmental. But because he knew himself. He knew what reopening old doors could cost. Now let's shift to the middle of the chapter, the deeper emotional layer. Ben wasn't angry at the email. He wasn't offended. If anything, he felt something closer to sadness. Not dramatic sadness, quiet sadness. Because reaching out directly hinted at something. Harry might not have many people left to contact. People underestimate loneliness at the top. They think visibility equals connection. It doesn't. There is a loneliness that only extremely public people understand. When everyone knows you, but very few know you. Ben understood that. He had lived it. But understanding someone's loneliness doesn't mean you can fix it. And it doesn't mean you should let it into your life if it threatens your balance. So the situation became more complex than most people realize. This wasn't a simple decision. It was a crossroads. Ben could respond and risk being pulled into someone else's narrative. Or he could remain silent and protect his own. And silence won. But silence didn't solve the problem. Because something unexpected happened next. The warning expanded beyond the personal and into the practical. The person closest to Ben reminded him of something important. If you show up with Harry, no one will believe it was accidental. Even if it was. Even if nothing else happened. Even if the moment lasted 5 minutes. The world doesn't operate on truth. It operates on assumption. And assumptions become headlines. Headlines become stories. Stories become permanent. So the true danger wasn't the email. It was the optics. Optics are the unspoken currency of public life. They determine who rises, and who sinks, and who survives quietly without being pulled into chaos. Ben couldn't risk becoming part of someone else's optics, even unintentionally. Let's pause again and ask the audience. Have you ever been in a situation where helping someone could hurt you? Not physically, emotionally, reputationally, and you had to choose between empathy and self-protection? That's the emotional space Ben stood in. Now we reach the final part of the chapter, the shift that takes us into the next phase of the story. Because the warning wasn't just about the email. It was about something else. The person who reacted believed the message wasn't random, and they weren't basing that on fear. They were basing it on experience. They believed Harry reached out because something was happening behind the scenes. Something the public didn't know about yet. Something that would soon make sense. Their exact words, according to one source, were, "This isn't about the race." Meaning, the F1 Grand Prix was the surface. The real reason was underneath. But what was it? A project? A documentary angle? A public rebranding effort? An attempt to attach himself to someone whose life wasn't currently in the headlines? Or was it something more personal? Something emotional? Something that would change the way Ben viewed the entire situation? We don't have that answer yet. Because this story is unfolding slowly, piece by piece, layer by layer. But here's what we do know. That warning changed everything. Ben didn't just hesitate after that. He shut down the possibility entirely. Not out of anger, out of clarity. And just when he thought the situation would fade quietly into normal life, something else happened. Something he didn't expect. The email didn't stay private. Someone else, outside the home, found out it existed. Not the content, just the fact that it was sent. And that meant one thing. Silence would no longer be a private decision. It would become a reaction. And reactions have consequences. Their history goes back further than anyone realized. Most people assume Ben Affleck and Prince Harry belong to completely separate worlds. One built on red carpets and film sets, the other shaped by palaces and protocol. But that's the surface. Beneath it, their paths crossed quietly, long before this email ever existed. And that's what makes this entire situation so much more complicated. Because this wasn't a stranger reaching out. It was someone who once stood close enough for familiarity. Close enough to be remembered, but not close enough to still belong. Let's start where most stories don't, with the moment no one talks about. Not the famous events. Not the charity galas. Not the public photo ops. We're going back to a time before everything changed, before Meghan, before Harry stepped away from the royal family, before headlines turned into battlegrounds. A time when Harry still had access to every room. A time when people didn't flinch at the idea of being connected to him. And yes, Ben was one of those people, but not in the way the public imagines. Their connection wasn't based on friendship. It was based on environment. For years, Harry moved through worlds most people never see. Not royal banquets. Not balcony appearances. Private events that take place in the shadows of charity networks, elite donor circles, and international gatherings where celebrities, politicians, and philanthropists share space without cameras. Ben Affleck didn't seek out those rooms. He was invited into them, quietly, because people forget something about Ben. He isn't just an actor. He is deeply involved in humanitarian work, long before it became a Hollywood trend. Foundations, global initiatives, silent partnerships with organizations that don't want publicity, they want results. And those circles overlap with the same global networks the royals move through. So yes, at one point, Harry and Ben existed in proximity, not close enough to form a bond, but close enough to remember each other. Close enough for Harry to believe that reaching out years later wouldn't be inappropriate. But here's where everything shifted. There was one moment, one interaction, that quietly ended any chance of a deeper connection. Not a fight, not a scandal, not a dramatic falling out. Just a moment. And sometimes a single moment is enough. But before we get to that, let's ask the audience. Have you ever misread a relationship? Believed you were closer to someone than they believed they were to you? Maybe you thought the connection meant something. Maybe they saw it as nothing more than coincidence. That's the emotional foundation of this chapter. Because what Harry perceived as familiarity, Ben experienced as distance. Not coldness, just clarity. Now, let's rewind to their earliest known overlap. Picture a charity event, not televised, not public, not glamorous. One of those gatherings filled with influential people who speak softly and think strategically. Harry was there as a representative of the royal family. Ben was there as a supporter for an international aid organization. They exchanged polite words. Nothing more. But something interesting happened in that interaction. Harry, used to being the most recognizable person in any room, was not the center of gravity. Ben wasn't either. The room was. The cause was. The mission was. And for the first time, perhaps, Harry found himself in an environment where his presence did not automatically shift the air, where he wasn't the headline, where people were not waiting to take pictures, they were waiting to take action. And that mattered. It mattered because Harry remembered it. Maybe not consciously, but emotionally. Fast forward a few years. Ben's life unraveled in front of the world, very publicly, very painfully. Everyone watching had an opinion. Everyone thought they knew the story. But while the world dissected Ben's lowest moments, Harry was dealing with his own private unraveling. Different circumstances, different scale, same emotional landscape. Loss, public pressure, identity crisis. Two men living different lives, but walking parallel emotional paths. They didn't speak then. They didn't form a bond. But recognition happened. Sometimes you don't need a friendship to feel understood. Sometimes you just need to see someone survive something you're afraid of facing yourself. Now comes the moment that ended the possibility of future connection. It wasn't what happened. It was what didn't happen. During one of Harry's visits to the United States, years before stepping back from royal duties, he attended a private event where Ben was also present. Not a party, not a social gathering, a closed-door discussion. The kind where confidentiality agreements are implied without being signed. Ben was quiet, focused, serious. Harry was charming, still carrying the energy of someone who believed his presence elevated the room. But the atmosphere shifted when Harry tried to initiate a personal conversation with Ben. Light, surface level, the kind celebrities exchange when they assume recognition equals warmth. Ben responded politely, but not personally, not in the way Harry expected. And Harry noticed. That's the moment people close to the situation refer to as the turning point. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because something inside Harry shifted. He realized Ben did not see him the way others did. Not as royalty, not as someone significant, just as another person in the room. And for someone who had lived a lifetime being treated as special, that experience was unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable. But here's where it becomes interesting. Years later, when Harry was no longer treated as automatically special, that old moment resurfaced emotionally. Memory works that way. We don't remember neutral moments until life makes them meaningful. Which brings us back to the email. Harry wasn't reaching out to a stranger. He was reaching out to a symbol. Ben represented something Harry had lost. Neutral acceptance. A space where he wasn't defined by drama. But here's the contradiction. The version of Ben Harry remembered no longer existed. Ben had changed. He had become more private, more selective, more protective of his peace. And while Harry's world expanded into chaos, Ben's world contracted into calm. So when Harry emailed, he unknowingly stepped into a version of Ben that no longer welcomed unexpected access. Now, let's return to the present moment, the email sitting in Ben's inbox. Someone close to Ben asked the first question. Why now? But another question followed. Does he think you're still connected? Because from Harry's perspective, the past wasn't closed. It was paused. From Ben's perspective, The past wasn't paused. It was finished. Two people, two interpretations, one collision point. Let's pause and ask the audience again. Have you ever had someone come back into your life assuming nothing changed, when everything did? That tension is where this story lives. Now, let's move into the middle shift. When word leaked, not content, just existence. People who knew the history reacted in an entirely different way. They weren't shocked that Harry reached out. They were shocked that he thought it would work. Because anyone who knew the old moment, the cooled interaction years ago, understood something Harry didn't. Ben was never going to reopen that door. Not because of anger, because of alignment. Ben's life and Harry's life once ran parallel. Now they run in opposite directions. One man moved toward stability. The other moved toward turbulence. One man stepped back from attention. The other stepped deeper into it, even while claiming to escape it. And that irony created distance that could never be bridged by a single email. Now we approach the end of the chapter, the moment that sets up what comes next. Because there was one more detail from the past that hasn't been mentioned yet. Something no one expected to matter. But it does. Years ago, during one of those quiet charity environments, Ben overheard something. Not about himself, not about Harry, but about the pressures of associating with royalty. Someone influential made a remark. When you stand beside a royal, you stop being yourself in the public eye. You become part of their narrative. Ben didn't react at the time, but he remembered it. And now, years later, when Harry reached out, that memory resurfaced. Because that statement was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it framed everything. So when Ben looked at the email, he didn't just see a request. He saw a future where he was no longer Ben Affleck, director, actor, father. He was Ben Affleck, Hollywood ally to Prince Harry. A title he never asked for. A headline he never wanted. And that's when the past and present collided in a single realization. This wasn't about history. It was about repeating history. And Ben refused. Which brings us to the cliffhanger. Because Harry didn't stop there. Once he realized Ben wasn't responding, he didn't walk away. He took a different approach, one no one saw coming. That moment didn't make headlines. It didn't trend. It wasn't whispered through tabloids. It wasn't mentioned in podcasts or leaked through anonymous sources close to the situation. But it changed everything. Because sometimes the most important shift in a relationship doesn't come from a public blow-up. It comes from a quiet embarrassment that no one else sees. And this is exactly that kind of moment. The moment that made Ben Affleck pull away long before the email ever arrived. The moment that ensured his silence wouldn't be accidental. It would be inevitable. Let's rewind. Not years this time, but just far enough to reach the point where everything pivoted. It happened at an event that most people never even knew took place. Not a glamorous premiere. Not a charity gala with flashing cameras. Not a televised award show. It was a private gathering. Small, selective, serious in tone. A room filled with people who weren't there for attention. They were there to make decisions, commitments, contributions. Ben was invited because of his long-standing work with humanitarian organizations. Harry was invited because he was a royal figure tied to global influence. They didn't go there as celebrities. They went there as contributors. And that mattered. Because in rooms like that, status means nothing. Only respect matters. Now, here's where the shift began. During the event, there was a private conversation taking place between a small circle of attendees, Ben included. Harry approached the group. Not aggressively, not arrogantly, just casually, like someone used to entering any conversation without asking permission. But that was the first misstep, because in that environment, no one interrupts unless invited. It wasn't a social gathering. It was a working discussion. People weren't chatting. They were planning. Harry didn't realize that. Or maybe he did, but assumed it didn't apply to him. Either way, he joined the conversation, and the group went silent. Not out of rudeness. Out of surprise, because they didn't expect him to enter a discussion he wasn't part of. Ben was the one who broke the silence. Politely, respectfully, but firmly enough that everyone felt the boundary. He redirected the conversation without including Harry. Not because he wanted to exclude him, because Harry wasn't part of the discussion. Harry stood there for a moment, caught between two identities. The prince who was used to automatic access, and the man who suddenly didn't have it. It was awkward. Not dramatic, not humiliating, just uncomfortable in the way only pride can feel. And even though no one else thought twice about it, Harry did. He walked away. Not abruptly, not angrily, just quietly. But quiet exits are sometimes louder than dramatic ones. Now let's pause and ask the audience. Have you ever been in a situation where you walked into a room believing you belonged, only to realize you didn't? That moment stays with you. Not because anyone was cruel, because the reality was unexpected. Harry carried that memory, not as resentment, as confusion, because until that moment, his identity had opened every door without question. Now let's move deeper into the emotional fallout. After that event, something changed. Not publicly, internally. Harry became more aware of how different his life looked outside palace walls. He started noticing when people treated him like a person instead of a symbol. Sometimes that felt refreshing. Sometimes that felt threatening. Ben represented that shift. Not intentionally. Ben didn't do anything beyond setting a boundary in a room that required boundaries. But for Harry, the experience attached itself to Ben emotionally. Not as anger. As unfinished business. Because emotional memory doesn't store itself by fairness. It stores itself by impact. And that moment had impact. Fast forward. Years passed. Life changed dramatically for both men. Ben rebuilt himself, privately, deliberately. Harry dismantled his old life, publicly, explosively. One man ran toward quiet. The other ran toward reinvention. One found stability through shrinking his world. The other sought identity through expanding his voice. But the emotional thread from that moment never disappeared. It just waited. Which brings us to the middle of this chapter, the part where everything begins to make sense. When Harry emailed Ben, he wasn't reaching out randomly. Whether consciously or not, he was trying to rewrite that old moment. The moment where he wasn't automatically included. The moment where he felt like an outsider. The moment that exposed a truth he wasn't ready to face. Outside the royal system, identity has to be earned, not assumed. And maybe Harry thought reconnecting with Ben would prove something. To himself, to the world, to the version of him that once stood awkwardly in that room. Now let's shift to Ben's perspective, because his internal response was completely different. Ben didn't remember that moment emotionally. Not the way Harry did. For Ben, it was just a boundary, one of thousands that happen every year in serious professional environments. He didn't attach meaning to it. He didn't carry it with him. But he did carry the principle behind it. Not every space is meant for everyone. Ben learned that the hard way too. Public life taught him pain before it taught him peace. He didn't earn calm easily. He earned it through consequences. So by the time Harry re-entered the picture through that unexpected email, Ben was no longer the man who would ignore subtle red flags. He noticed them instantly. Because people who have rebuilt themselves learn to read the small things. A tone, a timing, a request that assumes connection instead of earning it. All of it matters. Now let's explore the emotional core of the chapter. Harry believed the past gave him permission to reach out. Ben believed the past closed the door permanently. Neither man was wrong, but they were not in the same story anymore. Before the email, Harry's past connection with Ben felt like possibility. After the event years earlier, Ben's connection with Harry felt like conclusion. And that mismatch created the tension that led to silence. Now comes the final turn before the cliffhanger, the part that truly changed the dynamic. Because right after that awkward moment years ago, something else happened that Harry never forgot. Someone witnessed the interaction. Someone close to Harry. And their reaction was subtle, but sharp. They made a comment later that stung more than anyone realized. It went something like this. Not everyone treats you like a prince outside the palace. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was meant as realism. But realism hits harder when you've been protected from it your whole life. And Harry internalized it. Not consciously, emotionally. So when he emailed Ben years later, he wasn't just asking for access. He was asking for validation. A chance to prove that he still belonged in rare spaces. A chance to undo the discomfort of that long-forgotten moment. But here's the tragedy underneath. Ben had no idea any of that existed. So when he read the email, there was no emotional weight attached. Just caution. Just boundaries. Just the instinct to protect the life he fought incredibly hard to rebuild. Which brings us to the cliffhanger ending of this chapter. Because after Harry received silence, not rejection, just silence, he didn't interpret it as protection. He interpreted it as history repeating itself. And instead of stepping back, he made a new move. A completely unexpected move. One that would take this situation from private awkwardness to something much bigger. Ben Affleck wasn't worried about seeing Harry. He was worried about being seen with Harry. And that difference changes everything. Because in Hollywood, it's not the private moments that shape your future, it's the public ones. Especially the ones photographed. Especially the ones taken out of context. Especially the ones that end up everywhere before you even get home. So when that email arrived, it wasn't the request itself that triggered concern. It was the consequences attached to saying yes. Let's begin with a simple but powerful truth. Some people bring peace into your life. Others bring attention. And attention isn't always a gift. Sometimes attention is a storm disguised as an invitation. Now, before we go deeper, let's ask the audience a direct question. Have you ever avoided someone? Not because you disliked them, but because your life was finally calm? Because chaos can come in many forms. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it arrives as a friendly message with good intentions. But the effect is the same. It disrupts the balance you worked hard to build. That's exactly the emotional territory Ben stepped into. From the outside, people think Hollywood runs on ego, on clout, on fame, on proximity to bigger names. But insiders know the real secret. Hollywood runs on self-preservation. And no one understands that better than someone who's lived through the fallout of public exposure. Ben Affleck didn't just experience negative press. He survived it. He rebuilt after it. He learned to recognize the difference between attention he chooses and attention that chooses him. And Prince Harry, whether he realizes it or not, comes with the second kind. Now let's explore why being seen with Harry was the real danger, not the interaction itself. Because this wasn't 2013. This wasn't 2018. This wasn't a time when standing next to Harry was guaranteed good press. There are 3 reasons the stakes were different now. First, Harry's public image was no longer predictable. Some people admire him. Some criticize him. Some don't know what to believe. Uncertainty is more dangerous than negativity. Negativity burns quickly. Uncertainty lingers. Second, every appearance Harry makes becomes a narrative. Not sometimes. Every time. Whether he wants it or not. Whether he participates or not. Silence becomes commentary. Presence becomes symbolism. Absence becomes suspicion. You can't win. Third, anyone photographed beside him automatically becomes part of his storyline, even if they had nothing to do with it. That's not paranoia. That's pattern. Look at the last few years. Every interaction Harry has had publicly has turned into speculation. Who does he trust? Who supports him? Who is distancing themselves? Who is secretly advising him? Who is involved in his next project? Hollywood doesn't like unanswered questions. It avoids them. Because unanswered questions lead to assumptions. Assumptions lead to headlines. Headlines lead to damage control. And Ben has no interest in damage control ever again. Let's shift to a visual moment. The kind that explains why Ben didn't even consider saying yes. Imagine this scene. The Las Vegas Grand Prix is roaring in the background. The cameras are everywhere. The broadcast coverage is global. Ben and Harry appear together even briefly. Maybe just walking through a VIP entrance. There's a flash. A reporter takes a photo. That single moment becomes a headline before the event even ends. Now imagine the possible interpretations. Ben Affleck supports Prince Harry amid growing controversy. Ben and Harry rumored to collaborate on new project. Is Harry rebuilding his power circle in Hollywood? Jennifer Lopez and Meghan Markle planning joint appearance? None of those headlines would be true. But headlines don't have to be true to spread. They just have to be interesting. And Ben knows exactly how that game works. He spent years being written into stories that weren't his. He knows what it feels like when your entire identity becomes a headline written by strangers. Which brings us to another key point. Ben was finally out of the spotlight. Not professionally, personally. He had worked too hard to get there to risk stepping back into noise. Especially noise he didn't create. Now let's go deeper into something most people overlook. Ben's silence wasn't just about self-protection. It was about protecting the people around him. Because when you're a public figure, the fallout doesn't just hit you. It hits everyone connected to you. Your partner, your children, your family, your inner circle. And right now, Ben's world is built around stability.